Hi, Paul Thompson here from Spitfire Audio. I want to talk to you today about the organ. Where did the organ come from? How did it develop? And should you use it in your tracks? Well, the answer for me is an absolute yes. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit here and show you some information, and then we're going to jump over to a recording that I made back in the Union Chapel that has unfortunately never been used because the audio was a little bit crunchy in places. I've done a little bit of audio restoration work, and I think there's some really interesting stuff in there, so hold fire for that. But we'll start off here and I'll tell you about the organ. Now, for me, the organ is the original synthesizer. It has stuff in there that sounds like strings, woods, brass, but it isn't those things. This makes it incredibly useful for when you want to have something that sounds a little bit like those instrument groups, but you don't want it to be those instrument groups. And that's absolutely fantastic for giving your music a real character and something that the listener can kind of go, I can't quite work out what that is. This is incredibly useful. So, where did the organ come from? Now, we'll jump back into the real absolute history of the organ shortly, but let's talk about the recent developments. And by recent, I mean I'll start with up to the 16th century. So up to the 16th century, you had two places where you might find an organ. One was in a church, and the other was in the private residence of an extraordinarily rich person, because they were very, very expensive. What's the purpose in church? Well, the purpose in church is to literally frighten the peasants. It was to kind of awe the people coming into the church and to kind of make them feel like there was something really terrifying going on. Now, these early organs would have kind of the fluty stops, the kind of what we call 8-foot stop, which means that when you play a middle C, it sounds middle C as if, on a piano keyboard. And sometimes they would have 4-foot and 2-foot stops. However, these early organs were limited by the amount of air that could be blown through them, and they'd reached a point where they couldn't make them physically any louder. We'll come back to that. By the 19th century, as the symphony orchestra is developing, we are mimicking the symphony orchestra. So here you start to get more of these kind of really characteristic string-like sounds. Reed instruments are added, such as the oboe, and you also have brass sounds being added, like trombone, trumpet, and all of that kind of stuff. Confusingly, these are referred to as reeds in the organ dialect. In the strings category, you have pipes named things like vox humana, the kind of human voice. It's all very, very kind of twisted around and confusing. Also, celesta. I mean, when we think of a celeste, we think, the bell sound. But this is, in organ speak, these are stringy types sounds. Dulciana is another one, that kind of redolent of what you'd expect to hear. So as you go through to the 20th century, the idea is to make the organ sound more coherent as an instrument. Now, especially in France, you have this fabulous burst of development in the organ, in organ music as well, but you also have a fight against the sound. Now, Berlioz was one of the massive opponents of this development of the organ, and we're talking really about the kind of reintroduction of sound called mixtures. Now, what is a mixture? Well, mixtures came about with the peasants. Jump back to the peasants. You couldn't make the organ sound any louder, but what you could do was you could add lots of little tiny pipes that when you pushed the sound down, they increased the apparent volume, and these would be kind of harmonics. So you might have, a 12th or things like that being added into the sound to make the sound kind of sharper and more aggressive. These were rediscovered really in a massive way as the organ was being developed, especially in France. And Berlioz hated it. And I've got a great quote from him, which I will read out now. So remember, Berlioz is talking when we've got hydraulic power in the organ as well. So it's not just about what you can get from the bellows. This is a time when these mixtures are having a ton of air pumped into them. And Berlioz said, "The mixture stops of the organ, the effect of which is traditionally admired by many people, but which in reality are an open door to the most dreadful confusion. They give to each note simultaneously the notes of the major chord, in other words, the major third and perfect fifth. Barbaric it is, nonetheless, since quite apart from the harmonic congestion produced, it necessarily introduces into the harmony the most dreadful chaos, through the unavoidable inversion of chords. The ignorance of the Middle Ages groping for the laws of harmony must probably be credited with the introduction into organs of these monstrosities which routine has preserved and bequeathed to us. It is to be hoped they will gradually disappear. While sadly for Berlioz, they didn't gradually disappear. They in fact started appearing everywhere and in increasing numbers and styles. So with composers like Widor and Vienne and later Messiaen, we have this increasing declamatory style and aggressive dissonances appearing with these intense sounding organs. An example that I know intimately, having grown up playing it, is the organ in Worcester Cathedral. Now, this organ had touch controls as well at one stage, almost like a kind of early CS80. It could go from whisper quiet to the threshold of pain. This organ was installed in 1896 by this man, Robert Hope Jones. Elgar undoubtedly wrote his organ symphony for this organ, although sadly Hope Jones was so behind on the build, it wasn't completed until the year after the organ symphony was premiered. So it wasn't actually premiered on the organ that it was written for. But Elgar would have loved this organ, especially with the crazy control system. He was a gadget freak. He loved technology. He was constantly doing chemistry experiments in his back garden and occasionally blowing himself up. He loved the rapidly evolving gramophone, especially towards the end of his life. So who was Hope Jones? Well, he was a controversial figure. His first 4 electric organs that he built were sabotaged. They even set fire to the church in Hanover Square in London in an attempt, a successful attempt, to destroy the organ and to try and stop him. The church authorities knew that this was some kind of industrial sabotage. So they commissioned an identical second organ from him, and that was replaced. Between 1887 and 1911, he built 246 organs with 112 employees of his company. And yes, it was Hope Jones who invented the cinema organ as we know it. In 1903, being a not quite so talented businessman as he was an organ builder, he emigrated to America, some say in an attempt to evade a few creditors, and he started working at the Wurlitzer Company. In fact, the Wurlitzer Company acquired his company in 1910. Now, by this stage, Hope Jones had built over 100 church organs in the UK. He was a genius, but he was just terrible with money. You might recognise this chap. Mark Twain was an investor in one of Hope Jones's companies, and sadly he lost the money also that he invested in that company. Now, Hope Jones believed that the organ in the cinema especially was a replacement for the orchestra, so he set about trying to revolutionise the sound of the cinema. Now, before we very quickly delve into the real backstory, the real history, I'm going to recommend that you listen to 2 pieces to give you an idea of where we've got to at the kind of, let's call it the final stage of development of the organ. The first piece is by a composer called Jean Alain, and it's called Litanies. Now, Jean Alain came from a family of organists. His brother and sister were both organists. His father was an organ builder. He sadly only wrote 11 or 12 pieces. Can't remember the exact number. It was round about that. Because he was killed in action in the Second World War. But this piece, Litanies, is one of the classic pieces of organ repertoire. It's one of the most famous pieces. And the YouTube video that I'm linking you to has the organist who played all of the organ parts on Interstellar. So absolutely well worth watching. The second piece is the finale of Vienne's first organ symphony. And I love, Vienne was an incredible composer. He was also an amazing improviser. Legend has it that he died on the organ seat, and actually it was at the end of a service. At the end of the services, people would shout out a theme or a tune, and he would improvise to that theme. And supposedly, legend has it, he fell from the organ seat and his foot landed on the lowest note of the pedal board, and so there were a big, huge shaking of the church as the lowest note on the organ sounded out as Vienne passed away. So, again, an insanely incredible composer, really, really fabulous stuff. On a complete side note to that, there is a conductor slash organist slash pianist called Wayne Marshall. If you haven't come across his stuff, I strongly recommend you check him out. He also has this insane, incredible facility to improvise. Absolutely incredible. I mean, I would, when I was a kid, I turned pages for him a few times in the organ loft, and he would sometimes continue playing the final hymn, and it would turn into what sounded like a Vienne organ symphony. Anyway, I digress. So what is this? Well, this is a picture of Eusebius of Alexandria in the 3rd century BC, or BCE, if that's your flavour. He wanted to solve an engineering problem. So he was a fan of hearing people playing the flute and the panpipes and things like that. And he was one of the first kind of hydraulicists. He studied hydraulics and actually almost kind of created the official study of hydraulics as a thing. He was an engineer, and he wanted to solve this problem. How could one person play more than one wind instrument at the same time? And he came up with this, and it's a very, very clever piece of equipment. It works on hydraulics, as you might expect. He would have people pumping the bellows into the machine. There was a water reservoir to seal it off and maintain the pressure, and then that compressed air would be used to drive an organ. This is the organ. It is called the hydraulis. It's the earliest mechanical pipe organ. Here, built in 1435, we have the oldest playable pipe organ in the world, and this is at the Basilica of Valère in Sion in Switzerland. This is what an organ looks like if you let Frank Gehry design it. He is the architect of course, the Disney Hall. This is the largest organ in France. It has 8,000 pipes. It's, of course, the organ in Notre Dame. Luckily, this organ survived the fire. Sadly, there was another organ, a smaller organ, that didn't, but luckily this organ survived intact. So here's the organ that I grew up playing in Worcester Cathedral. As you can see in the picture, there are 2 organ boxes on either side of this, and this part of the cathedral is called the choir. So of the 4 manuals, the top manual is called Solo, and that has the, I call the reeds, but actually it's the kind of brass sounds, and that's for soloing and fanfares and things like that. The next keyboard down is called the Swell, and that is because it is controllable dynamic. It has these kind of shutters on the organ box that have those pipes in, so you can swell it up and down, get louder and softer. The next one down is called the Grate, and that's where traditionally the kind of loudest, most commonly used stops are. And then on the bottom is the choir, and that is more commonly used for kind of accompanying the choir at quiet moments. And that tends to have these kind of vox dulcianas and all of those really gentle stops. The Grate and choir divisions are mainly in that south case, and then the swell division is in the north case. Now, the effect of this, when you're actually sitting in the middle, either in a concert or in some, at a service of some kind, is the most amazing surround sound, which is accentuated even further, if I show you another picture, by this box, which is in one of the transepts. So that's kind of around the corner and quite a way away. This is the solo section that I mentioned before, and also the pedals. Now, this introduces a really interesting mental challenge for playing the organ, because the organ always sounds slightly behind what you're playing anyway because of the physical mechanics of it. Obviously, the air has to start going into the pipe has to start resonating and making a sound, that sound has to travel back to you. But this is complicated still further in organs designed like this, because when you're playing that solo keyboard or when you're playing the pedal board, your feet and that hand have to be even earlier ahead of the beat than the other manuals, the other keyboards. So you've got kind of double time delay to try and manage in your head. Finally, this one is the largest pipe organ in the world. It has 17,000 pipes. And this one is St. Stephen's Cathedral in Passau in Germany. So how did the organ originally become this kind of Gothic thing? How did it turn into this horror sound? Well, there was a tradition in Victorian novels of the image of the organist playing at night. Now, this is entirely normal, that, the cathedrals, the churches, whatever, are being used during the day. And it's not possible for the organist to play and practice during the day. So they would always practice at night in these kind of darkened, empty buildings. So when we come to The Phantom of the Opera, published in 1909, we end up with this guy, Lon Chaney, who played the Phantom in the 1925 movie. So the Phantom lives in the cellars beneath the opera house with this gigantic organ. Interestingly, his makeup was embargoed, and when audiences saw this, they screamed and fainted, and all hell broke loose. Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor was first used in the 1931 film Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But the organ's been used in quite a few different movies over the years, and 2001 is an obvious example where the opening of Also sprach Zarathustra by Richard Strauss. Wendy Carlos used the organ in the Royal Albert Hall for her fantastic score to the movie Tron. And if you listen to this, there is a cue, I'll link the cue below, or at least put the name of the cue below, where the organ features very heavily. And it's a kind of, it's like, for our purposes, a kind of meta thing that you're listening to, because it's Wendy orchestrating for the organ as if it is the orchestra, which is absolutely fascinating. Well worth a listen to that. In Kioniscozzi, Philip Glass uses the organ not only with the orchestra but also with solo vocals as well. In Herman's score for Vertigo in 1958, the meeting in the Redwood Forest is scored with organ, and it's no mistake that this is kind of designed to give you that kind of slightly uncomfortable, haunted feeling. Even in films like 97's The Little Mermaid by Alan Menken, you find the organ makes a feature, and again, it's kind of when you have this song, Poor Unfortunate Souls, it's giving you that, you know, that kind of ethereal feel. This picture needs no further explanation. I'm sure you will have noticed that there is a lot of organ in this film, and I'll link a great example below. Now, one of the joys of Spitfire is that it's enabled me to kind of guide us to making two fantastic organs, one of which is the organ that was used at the beginning of this film. It's the opening sound. And that is the Rugby School Chapel organ. It's called Symphonic Organ. And we've got a fantastic interview on the Spitfire channel, which I'll link below as well, of me talking to Andy Richards and him telling us about the history of his being at the school and his experience of the organ and how he came to go back and rediscover it later on in his music career. And it really is a spectacular chapel. It has the benefit of being a cathedral-sized organ in a much smaller building, in a school chapel, which is why it has that incredibly intense sound. But my abandoned bit of film that we're absolutely about to leap into now was actually shot in the Union Chapel where we made our other organ. So that is a very different sounding instrument. So the interview we're going to cut to now was shot in the Union Chapel with me seated at the Union Chapel organ. And while, as I said at the beginning, it's got some crunchy sound, which is why we didn't use it. I've had to unearth it from the archives. There is some really interesting stuff in there, and I demonstrate some things at the console, and you can hear what I'm talking about and what I'm doing. So I'm just going to run it for you. Please forgive the dodgy sound in places. Hi, I'm Paul Thompson from Spitfire Audio. We're here today at the Union Chapel, building which was completed in 1877, and that was also the year that this amazing organ was installed. It's hardly been changed since that date. There have been a few small modifications, but it's pretty unique in that the actual pipes and the mechanics of the of how the hydraulics and the airflow and the connection between the keyboard and the pipes, it's pretty unique that pretty much hasn't changed since the day it was put in here. So this goes back to January 2014, when Claire, the director of music here at the Union Chapel, contacted us to tell us about the organ. It'd just been restored. They've done quite a lot of work on, just kind of getting it back up to a really kind of mint condition. And she thought that it would be a perfect opportunity to kind of record it for posterity, partly for the organisation here, which is a non-profit organisation that exists to help the homeless. It's also a non-denominational place of worship, and it has obviously it's a host to a number of very significant concerts over the last few years, and it's a great place. It's an octagonal building, which is quite unusual, and it has a fantastic acoustic. And I think part of that is probably due to the galleries and the kind of tiered seating around the outside of the building. So it makes a really interesting kind of scattered sound wave effect. It's got quite a chaotic sound in here, which is always nice. The way that the organ has developed over the years, from the 17th century, it was kind of more ecclesiastical, it was more liturgical. The idea was for it to play a part in church services and things like that. Occasionally there would be a private organ in a residence, so that would be a slightly different kind of idea then. But the main idea of it was to use in religious worship. And then as it developed through the centuries, you get through to the 19th century when it starts to become more a reflection of what the symphony orchestra was at that point. So you start to get reeds coming in, which obviously are kind of imitating orchestral reeds. You've got brass stops coming in and a category of stops that are trying to emulate string instruments. And I'll show you a couple of different examples of that shortly. The organs that were being developed at the start of the 20th century tended to be a kind of combination of these different kinds of instruments. So the trick was to make something where the organ sounded like a kind of coherent instrument, but where you had some of these elements from the 17th, 18th century, some of the romantic elements from the 19th century, and just basically kind of gathering those together into one instrument, which then has multiple uses. There was a huge influence from France where an entire category of organ music developed, which used a lot of dissonance, for example, and was quite kind of declamatory in style. Looking back to plainsong for some of its influence, but also really advancing the kind of harmonic colours that were being used at the time. One way of looking at the organ is to look at it as an actual instrument, and not a lot of people have played an organ, but I am a former cathedral chorister, so when my voice broke, I started having organ lessons, and I already played the piano, so it's kind of, there are a couple of differences in technique, but it was kind of interesting and fun to learn the new instrument, extremely loud instrument, which is always exciting. And I used to kind of practice late at night in the empty cathedral in the dark, which was also interesting sometimes. But basically, it's a kind of similar to the piano keyboard, as you can see. There's no sustain pedal. So one of the things that you have to master are different ways of playing legato, different ways of smoothly playing the notes together. And that's going to partly depend on the room that you're playing in, that the organ is installed in. And a lot of people say that the room is an essential part of the organ, that they operate as one thing. Now, in here, if I play some staccato notes, you can hear that there's quite a lot of reverb after that. So you don't need too much of an overlap between the notes to make it sound legato. And you can actually emphasize notes by exaggerating that. And there is on most of the stops, there isn't any dynamic. So you have to find other ways of creating the dynamic, either by the way that you're playing or by how you join the note to the previous and next note. Now, another important thing that you learn to do is called substitution. So if you have a chord and you want to go smoothly to the next chord, and let's say the next chord is up here somewhere, and let's say that I've ended up here, I'll substitute. So you can see that I'm changing fingers while I'm holding the note down. So those are the two kind of main things. There's obviously the pedal board to contend with as well, which adds an extra slight layer of complication, but also gives you a lot of kind of colour for the bottom end. So talking about the different categories of stops, we have 3 manuals on this organ. The central one is called the grate, and that tends to house the louder stops, and it also has more of the principal or diapason stops, which are the kind of really traditional. They're the sounds on the organ that are not trying to imitate anything else. That's just pure organ. And if I play a fragment from a hymn tune, you'll hear it's this kind of sound that you traditionally associate.
So within the registers, you can see that there is a name given to each of the stops, but there's also a number next to it. And that tells you about the length of the pipes and therefore which octave you're going to be playing. So if I just listen to the 8-foot pipes, and then I put the 4-foot pipes, you can hear that's an octave higher. 2 feet, an octave higher still. And then in amongst those, you have a 12th and a mixture, which is a collection of smaller pipes. So within those different sounds, you can kind of create something that's very pure. You can add colour to it still in the harmonic series, and then you can add these extra notes that are out of the chord that you're playing, but add a kind of crunch to the sound. And then you've got the reeds as well, that if you want to pull those in, you get a very brassy sound. And just to show you those on their own, so the trumpet, and the clarion, which is a 4-foot sound, and if you put them together, so there's a great collection of sounds here on the grate. Now the choir has at the bottom here the Dulciana and the Viol d'Amour. These are some of the string stops on this organ. So if I give you a quick blast of these. So you can hear that those are giving you a kind of stringy sound. That was a little bit flutier, but intended to be a string replacement. And then on this one up here is called the swell, and this has a foot pedal at the bottom, which has physical flaps surrounding the open side of the box. So you can control the dynamic on, this is the only way that you can control the dynamic on a specific set of stops. So you can hear that getting louder, but also it becomes less kind of muted. There's when the box is closed, it's much more muted sound. But those are the kind of stringy sounds on there as well. And some keyboards have a 16-foot, which gives you an octave down. So that gives a kind of weightier, rounder, more bassy sound to the proceedings. So on the swell, we've got a similar kind of collection of sounds. We can get our diapason, 4-foot flute, and then we can add into that the mixture, which gives you the crunchy sound, and then the trumpet and clarion. And also, if we want to go back to our kind of stringier type of sound, we've got a tremulant, which adds a very kind of softly undulating kind of chorus type of sound. In the pedals, the standard stop is the 16, and this is the quietest one. If I pull in the others, oops, and then you've got an 8-foot principal, and you've got a reed as well. So, the other thing that you can do with the organ is you can connect different parts of it together, and this is a mechanical connection as well. So we can add the keyboards to the pedal board. So if I pull out a nice crunchy mixture of stuff on the keyboards, you'll hear. Bit out of practice, but you get the idea. And then you can join the different manuals together as well. So if I just switch the pedals off for a minute. Let's say that we had quite a straight sound on the grate, but we wanted to be able to add in part of colour on the organ is not just doing this kind of that kind of contrast, but actually playing on the one keyboard and then adding the stops from the other keyboard to that keyboard. So some electronic or organs that have electronic systems in to help you pick the stops, it's kind of easier because there's a row of buttons underneath here that you can push while you're playing. With this kind of organ, you have to incorporate it into performance. So, for example, you might, I'll try and do this, no guarantee, it's 25 years since I was practicing properly, so no guarantee that I'll get this right, but you could, for example, play like this. So you get the idea, there's lots of things you can do while you're playing. Sometimes you can change the sound by dropping out slightly. So if we were playing on the 8-foot stops and we want to add the 4-foot stops, so you make it the start of a new phrase, or when you drop from the octave, that can be the point because your ear is expecting it to go back up. So that's pretty much how the instrument works. As I mentioned, this is this organ has a mechanical connection to the pipes, and you can hear that in action. If I press a note, hang on. If I press a note down on the choir, but then if you listen carefully, I'll just press it very, very gradually. So you can hear there that there's a very direct connection between your hand and what's happening in the pipes. So you can alter your performance, and as you kind of scatter across the keyboard, you do get a slightly different sound. So that is the one other way that you can, with a mechanical organ, that you can get a kind of change in the timbre of the notes that you're playing. We've recorded quite a lot of stuff at Air Lyndhurst Studios in Hampstead in London, and there are certain similarities between this building, or at least the interior that we're recording in today, and that in that they have galleries that are kind of fairly similar. The shape is slightly different, but Air is a kind of slightly rounder room. And this building has slightly more kind of arched, don't know what the technical term is, but where some of the octagonal sides are, there is quite a steep arch in the ceiling, which is going to give an extra kind of reverberation. This is obviously a working building. It's not a recording studio, but it has the advantage of the organ having been built into this building as it is now. So they were designed to go together, and the layout of the organ case is kind of a function of the layout of the building as well. It's designed to kind of project the sound around the outside rather than just into the centre of the building. So I grew up singing a lot of music by composers from the English tradition, such as Howells, Sumption, Finzi, Vaughan Williams, and Elgar, of course. I was incredibly lucky to have two very good organ teachers who, Dr. Donald Hunt, who's the noted kind of Elgar specialist and vice president of the Elgar Foundation, and Adrian Partington, who is the current director of music at Gloucester Cathedral. Both of them had very distinguished backgrounds and had studied with these amazing composers. And I think that there's a kind of line through this development of the English tradition and the kind of romantic but slightly modal quality of this music. And I'd include Finzi, actually, of course, in this category. And the development of kind of post-romantic era film music. So, you know, going from the kind of 40s onwards, I guess. And there are a lot of similarities listening to the music of Howells, for example, or Finzi, and listening to modern film music. You hear quite a few similarities. There's quite a lot of modal, there's a lot of rule breaking of, you know, parallel fifths. And things like that, which you wouldn't do, and kind of strange notes like where you're constantly going backwards, sometimes backwards and forwards between major and minor. So there's a lot of stuff that was being done then where the rules were all getting ripped up and thrown away, which has kind of carried through into the modern tradition of film music. And I think that that's something where the use of the organ, in terms of replacing or adding to different sections of the traditional orchestra, this is somewhere where you can get real good value from the organ, because the organ was, a lot of this music was written for the organs, particularly Finzi Hausensumption wrote a lot of choral music for the church, and Elgar obviously wrote a lot of music that was designed to be performed in cathedrals with organs amongst the instruments. So there's a definite kind of cultural baggage that comes with the sound of the organ and with that English tradition. So my experience as an organist, albeit quite a while ago now, has kind of given me a perspective on how I think we should record the instrument. I know from, part of being an organist and preparing a piece for performance is going through and working out, almost like your kind of orchestration, what am I going to use at this particular section? Which keyboard am I going to be playing on? How do I build the piece up and break it down again? And there's quite a lot of kind of creative balancing of sounds involved in that process. If you want the really stringy texture, then you add in a really powerful diapason, you're not going to hear it. It's going to obliterate it. So it's a kind of an alternative form of orchestration in some ways. There's an enormously wide range of sounds that you can get from it. It's not just the kind of, I know we are in an perfect example of Gothic architecture. And it has this kind of, Count Dracula sort of a kind of image, but it really isn't just that. That's a real kind of cliche. So I think that the kind of when you hear the amount of different colours you can get from this instrument, I think people will realise that it's incredibly versatile.
And there we are. Okay, so I hope you found that interesting. I know it's been a bit of a long one, this, but it's just such a passion of mine. There's so much fascinating information. I couldn't really edit any of it out. So if you've made it this far, congratulations, you win a gold medal. And hopefully I've given you some insight into why the organ is such a great instrument to incorporate into your tracks, into your scores, and can really give you a unique feel and a unique sound. You can substitute it in where you would traditionally use something else, and it will give you an edge, I promise you. Thank you very much for bearing with me. Thank you very much for watching. One of those, always great. Ding the bell, subscribe if you haven't already. Look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks. Bye-bye.